Okay, it is now just after 10 o'clock in the morning, so we'll just make a start at this point, and if anyone joins us, we'll just bring them up to the speed. So I believe that this is our last really a teaching session that we're gonna have on this course. So this week you will be taking the exam 4 and lab practical test number 4 as well. So those are the two only new assignments that I'm asking you to complete. So what we're going to do today and what we did last Tuesday, so yesterday in the class, we're going to review the study guide. So you will find the study guide as before on your Canvas course shell. But as you have gone to gotten to learn about how my study guides work, there are bits here and there that are missing. And usually those are important words, important concepts, important things that I really want you to go through that process of physically writing to your notes. So this is the only place other than in the class where you will get the answers to the study guide. I do not upload the completed one. The reason for that is, as I've shared before, that all of the questions in the actual exam are pulled from these study guides. So I do open book tests, so you can refer to that. You can use that as your assistance for that exam, and for that reason it is important for me that at least you end up doing a little bit of a manual writing of getting those answers to your study guide. So just in interest of time, I think we're gonna make a start. When we went through this in the last class, we got through all of it in less than an hour. Of course, that depends a little bit how the conversation goes and how the topics come up, but that's kind of roughly what I'm expecting for today. What you'll notice when you browse through the study guide is that majority of it focuses on the digestive system. So digestive system has some 7 pages where we have 2 pages for male and 2 pages for female, approximately 2 pages of reproductive systems. So that gives you an idea of the emphasis being heavily on the digestive system in terms of the questions that you can expect on the exam as well. And if I remember correctly, there is going to be an extra credit question in the exam, and that's going to be from the second last page on your study guide, which was this diagram of the female monthly cycle, kind of connecting all the concepts that we have been looking at. So that's the little extra credit question. You remember that you can always prepare to the extra credit question by typing that ahead of the time on a notepad or Word or wherever. What I'm looking is really a 1 paragraph of explanation of what happens, what it is, what sort of options we have for outcomes if a pregnancy occurs, if pregnancy doesn't occur in female menstrual cycle. So that's the extra credit question. Do remember that the exam itself does have a time limit. It's not tough. There's plenty enough time to answer, but some students prefer to prepare their extra credit question ahead of the time. Again, you don't need to take that if you feel that you're comfortable, you're getting the score you want simply through the exam questions. So without a further ado, I think where we should start by looking at this digestive system. And I'm trying to get my mouse to work, so bear with me. Well, that was interesting how it worked. So we're going to talk a little bit about digestive system. And as always, I kind of try to connect things together and formulate some sort of an overall arching idea of how systems are connected. So since we are going to be focusing on the digestive system, and I'm really sorry, it seems that my mouse is really not having a great time today, but I'm sure we can make it make it through today regardless. So let's try that instead. No, still no luck. So since we are going to be talking about the digestive system, it's important or useful for us to have an idea how that connects into everything that we've seen before in our study of the human body. And of course, we saw that the big function that our body did was to get in nutrients and convert from those nutrients the sugars into ATP. And this happened, of course, at the level of mitochondria. We've talked about that structure in our introductory level courses. But one thing that we'll end up seeing is that as a byproduct, we are left with carbon dioxide and water. Those need to be eliminated from the body, and that's where what we earlier on had a look of the respiratory system and urinary system step in. So those are really kind of the connections between all these systems, how they work together, what we see. So just kind of putting concepts together and remembering that kind of a more of a global approach than looking one system at the time. Well, let's think of the functions of the digestive system. Of course, we need to take the food in. We need to break the large molecules into smaller. This was a concept known as digestion. And only once large food molecules have been broken into smaller, they are small enough that they can be absorbed to the body. So they can pass to the bloodstream and then around the body. Remember that even though food goes inside you while you eat it, technically digestive tract is just a tube starting from mouth, one end, ending at the other end, and that tube is continuous. So really, if you consider it this way, food only gets into the body once it gets absorbed, so it crosses that plasma membrane there, that membrane between the digestive tract and the insides of your body. So the two terms digestion and absorption are going to be really important, and it's really important for me that you know the difference between them. Digestion, breaking large food molecules into smaller, absorption, those small molecules now being able to pass into the body. And of course, digestive system serves the final purpose that we are listed here, eliminating anything that cannot be digested. And some amount of fiber is of course important and useful. It allows us to, for the material in the digestive tract to be pushed onwards, gives us a sense of being full, almost kind of helps to clean the tubing, if you wish, kind of scraping the material along. So those were our key concepts, especially the digestion and absorption, that I really do want you to be comfortable with and ready to discuss. Let's have a look of two types of movements, and these two types of movements we've seen before in our discussions. So what happens in peristalsis is that the food moves along the track in kind of a synchronized, coordinated manner. So peristaltic movements of vessels are movements where part of that vessel contracts and part immediately next to it contracts again. So it generates this wave-like movement that helps to push the material along in that tube. So that's our peristalsis. And we saw examples of that. We're going to talk about in terms of digestive system, passing food along, but we've seen examples, for example, in the urinary system, and so on and so on. The other type of movement that we run into, especially in the digestive system, is going to be segmentation. And segmentation, again, we have parts of the vessel contracting, but this time they're not going to contract in a very synchronized manner. They contract here and there. So that contraction there helps to squeeze some of that food, break some of that food within that tube and mix it with its immediate surrounding. However, segmentation really doesn't serve for passing food along that track. Because there's no coordination in those contractions as such. So I hope that that helps with remembering those two types of movements. I think we used an example in the class of a toothpaste tube and how some people grab it just from the middle and squeeze and some toothpaste comes out. That would be segmentation, but then you get those people who work systematically from one end to another. That would be more of an example of peristaltic movement. So now that we have had a look of those, let's discuss about concept that we've kind of seen something similar in the past. So we've discussed in the past that in many systems that we look at, we end up seeing layers, for example, with blood vessels and so on and so on. And these layers are present regardless of what kind of a tube or part of that system it is, but there are some general structures. And that's what we end up noticing with the digestive tract as well. There's going to be 4 general layers, and often they are called as tunicas or tunics. And these 4 layers can be found in pretty much all parts of the digestive tract, regardless of where along that path we are. Of course, at certain parts, the tubing, the digestive tract gets wider, certain parts it gets narrower, certain parts it gets thicker, some parts it gets thinner, but in general, we end up finding these 4 layers at all parts of the digestive tract. So let's start working our way from a vessel and from the very center of the vessel. The center part of the vessel is known as the lumen of a vessel. And the very first layer that we end up finding being present is going to be mucosal layer. So that would be shown in this diagram with the number 1. A mucosal layer is in direct contact with the material that passes through the digestive tract. So that serves a purpose of protecting the other layers further along. We also see that materials need to be able to absorb. So some of those small food molecules entering into the body through that mucosal layer. And similarly, certain materials from the body get secreted into that tube where the food material passes through. So mucosal layer is especially adapted to facilitate the movement of secretions and absorption. So it's not very thick, it's easy to pass. So that would be the first characteristic that's really definitely worth of a note when it comes to the tunicas of the digestive tract. The next layer that I want to talk about, we see here that the name gives us a clue, as we've seen many times in A&P. So submucosa, the name itself refers, it's a layer below the mucosal layer. This layer is rich with glands. It contains a lot of blood vessels, nerve endings, lymphatic vessels. So it really serves to regulate the digestive processes. So a lot of secretions originate from here. Blood gets directed either in greater quantities or lesser quantities to this layer in response to the needs that we have for the body. A lot of nerve sensation that then triggers further responses. So shown as a number 2 on this diagram, submucosa, and that was the function of that one. And I do apologize, I don't think I'm able to draw the diagrams this time. It seems like my keypad is a little bit ready to wrap up the semester. So the next layer, which on this diagram is shown with the number 3, and actually you can see 2 separate layers within number 3, that's our muscular layer. A muscular layer really controls the diameter, length, the movements within the tube of the digestive tract. And what we end up finding, we typically have 2 layers there. The innermost layer is a circular layer, so controls, like I said, this diameter of the tube. It would play a role in segmentation and also in peristalsis. The layer that's a little bit outer more from that is going to be longitudinal muscular layer. And this layer then helps with controlling the muscle fibers running to the opposite direction from the innermost layer. So kind of controlling the length of the vessel and so on. There is going to be one place in the body where, or the digestive tract, where we end up seeing a 3rd layer. And this 3rd layer is found only within the stomach. And this is going to be oblique layer. So oblique layer fibers don't run along to any of the planes that we've seen before. They run kind of off from those. So why would we find that within the stomach? Think of the function of the stomach. Stomach is really the place where we mix the food material that's gotten into the body with stomach acids. A lot of mixing happens, breaking apart. So we want to be able to control the distension and shrinking of the stomach. So that's the response there. The final 4th layer that I wanted to chat a little bit about with you is going to be our serosa. So serosa is shown in this diagram with number 4. This is made of connective tissue, and this really helps to anchor the digestive tract tubing to its side. It also enforces that tube a little bit. So these 4 layers we end up seeing throughout various different parts of the digestive tract. So something to be aware of. And now we get to have a look of one interesting structure that we haven't really talked too much about. I have mentioned it to you, but there is a very specific reason why I do want to talk at least a little bit about it with you. And this structure is going to be peritoneum. So peritoneum is a connective tissue layer, serous membrane layer that lines the abdominal cavity. You can see it on this diagram that I have prepared here for us. It encircles the entire abdominal cavity, and some of the organs within the abdominal cavity kind of locking them onto their place, helping in that sense that they're held where they need to be. The reason why I do want to talk about the peritoneum is really because we often use it as an anatomical landmark and describe other structures in relation to the peritoneum. So they can be retroperitoneal, behind the peritoneum, intraperitoneal, within the peritoneum, subperitoneal, underneath the peritoneum, and so on and so on. So that's a structure that you probably will end up seeing. A part of the peritoneum that's something that we mentioned in the class is a structure known as a greater omentum. And we can see greater omentum on this diagram as this little fold that comes. And this fold is really forms kind of, if you dissect into the abdominal cavity, it's one of the layers after the skin and muscles, adipose tissue. Once you get into that abdominal cavity, that you'll end up seeing this kind of a flap-like structure anteriorly that we might need to cut through or fold it up. So we end up seeing other structures within the abdomen. So just something to bear in mind if you end up doing dissections. In terms of the neural control, what regulates the digestive tract, Well, whenever the parasympathetic branch of autonomic nervous system is active, that's when the digestive system is stimulated. So you remember that sometimes we describe the parasympathetic branch as a rest and digest branch. So what happens after a Thanksgiving meal, for example? You sit down, you really can even feel that all that blood is going to your gut. You feel restful, you feel tired, a lot of functions slow down, such as a heart rate, pupil diameter, respiratory rate, and so on. So a lot of parts of your body are slowing down, but one part that's picking up is gonna be our digestive system. So digestive system is working hard. So it's when the parasympathetic branch is stimulated that the digestive system is working a lot. Another thing that I think is kind of an important one just to notice as a general concept that I wanted to emphasize is the blood and what happens for the blood from the gut. You remember that it was the blood that picked up the nutrients and energy from the food once it gets absorbed to the body. And that blood, without few exceptions, all goes to the liver. So after blood has passed through the liver, then only it gets passed to the other parts of the body. And you might wonder why this would be the case. Remember, your body is kind of a greedy. All the cells in the body are greedy. If there is energy available, the cells will go and burn it off. So we really need to regulate this. And liver can be considered, I'm using an analog here as like the grown-up of the bunch, that stores the energy for later use whenever you might need it. So that's the big contribution of liver in terms of the blood supply from the gut region. Of course, liver does a bunch of other things, as we'll see in towards the end of this section. So that really allows us now to move our focus on discussing the digestive tract. And how we're going to discuss the digestive system is that we discuss the tract, the tube, starting from one end, mouth, going through various parts to the other end, and then we'll look at accessory structures that complement that. There's going to be few accessory structures that we'll mention along the way as well, but at large, that's the plan. And the first part that we're going to talk about is going to be our mouth, or sometimes it can be referred as an oral or buccal cavity. But before we start talking about that, I do want to remind you that we discussed where does the digestion start, and that would make a great exam question. Well, remember that digestion starts already before the food enters to the mouth. So simple sight, smell, or even a thought of a food can trigger the salivary production. And remember, saliva contained things such as salivary amylase, which played important role in breaking down starches and so on. So you could really say, I guess, that digestion starts even before food enters to the mouth. Anyone who's studying psychology will have probably heard about Pavlov's dogs and salivation and all that. So that's a kind of a good mnemonic to hold on to that. If we think of the functions of the food, functions of the mouth, well, there's quite a few. Of course, for us, it's going to be the entry route for the food, but there's a lot other stuff that goes on. We do a lot of screening of that food before it enters into our body. So taste, smell, texture, temperature, things like that we look for. Is what we're about to eat gonna be a good idea to be eaten? So there's a lot of kind of checks that go on that level. Another thing that we notice that the mouth plays an important role is in the speech production. So of course the voice started at the level of voice box, but further manipulation happens at the level of the mouth. So communication, really, we rely a lot on a vocal communication in our societies. So speech production is an important part of what mouth is being used for. So worthily adding to that list. And what I did next, I have listed different boundaries that we have for the mouth. So where does what structures form the edges of the oral cavity? And the reason why I like asking this question, and sometimes also in the exam, is that it combines the anatomical terminology that I think you are already familiar with from your previous courses, and it combines the terminology that the structures that we have learned in this chapter. So it's really a chance to kind of show everything you've taken away and remind ourselves of that. So let's go through that quickly. So the boundaries of the mouth anteriorly, so at the front, it's going to be our lips. So our lips prevent that food doesn't fall out from the oral cavity in an anterior aspect. One term that I wanted to share with you, just so you've seen it and are comfortable, the space between the gums and the lips that you'll see, that is known as a vestibule. So you might end up seeing that term being used. That vestibule kind of refers as a term to a chamber. So it's this chamber between the teeth, gums, and the lips. Dentists especially work on that space largely. On the sides, so laterally, our mouth is defined by our cheeks. So we've got a couple of important muscles there. And superiorly, so at the top of our oral cavity, we're going to have the palate. And remember that we had a hard palate anteriorly, that's where the bone was within. And then we had the soft palate posteriorly, so more towards the back. From the back of the soft palate, of course, we've got our uvula hanging out. Inferiorly, so at the bottom of the oral cavity of the mouth, tongue takes a prominent part of that, so forming the floor of the mouth. And posteriorly at the very back, it's going to be our pharynx, and especially the oropharynx. So the part behind the oral cavity, that part of pharynx was known as oropharynx. A couple of other things to mention when we talk about the tongue. Remember, tongue formed the floor of the mouth, and what we end up noticing is that tongue is made of skeletal muscle. There are going to be groups of structures, both intrinsic and extrinsic skeletal muscles. The intrinsic ones control the shape, whereas extrinsic ones the position. So we do both for the tongue. So as a combination is what we're able to achieve. And tongue plays a really important role in mixing the material in the mouth, doing that sensory reception, moving the material to the back of the mouth when we're ready to swallow, and so on and so on. We will talk more about the term bolus in a little bit, I think more towards the end of this section, but notice that when we have now taken the food to the mouth and we have started that mechanical breakdown of it through the process of chewing, and we mix it with saliva, we no longer talk about food. So the material that passes through the digestive tract, it's called with different names at different parts based on what has happened to it, what its mixture is, and so on. So we are not going to talk about the food anymore at this level. We're going to talk about bolus. So bolus is the mixture of saliva and food material when the food material has also been broken down. Of course, one thing that I didn't mention from the tongue earlier on, the important role in speech production as well. There's a couple of structures within the tongue and within the oral cavity that I wanted to touch upon. Mention. So you remember papillas were these small rounded projections from the tongue, taste buds often referred as, and then we had this connective tissue band known as frenulum. This is a connective tissue band, and we can find it in a few different places, and I'm looking for a diagram here, so bear with me. So let's zoom in here. And frenulum really connects here between the gums and the lip. So it forms this connective tissue band here. We find that in the lower jaw, and we find it also at the upper jaw. There's going to be another frenulum underneath the tongue that we see, and this frenulum is going to be useful for us as, again, as an anatomical landmark as we talk about openings of the salivary gland ducts. So sometimes if a baby has trouble, for example, with latching and so on, it might be necessary to cut that. But you can see it fairly prominently on many people. Oh, I don't know what I did there. Let's see if we can fix that. So that was the structure of frenulum that I wanted to share with you. Final structure that I do want to mention, so we don't look past this, is going to be our uvula. That was the hanging projection from the very posterior part of the soft palate at the back of the mouth. And we had examples of a normal uvula and bifid uvula in the class and so on. Let's move on and continue our journey. And I'm going to make a jump off from what I said that we will do and have a look at a couple of accessory structures. And these are going to be our salivary glands. So saliva plays important role in how we end up processing food already early on. So not only that it starts to break down starches through salivary amylase, also saliva plays an important role in moistening the food so that the swallowing is doable and easy and not painful. You might remember with some groups I have discussed about cornflakes and history of cornflakes. Imagine eating them without any liquid. That'd be tough. Of course, saliva also cleans mouth. It dissolves the food, so we get the taste sensation released from the food and so on. A lot of these things like chewing gum really rely on promoting the production of saliva in your mouth to clean the mouth after a meal and so on. In a day, single day, about 1.5 liters of saliva is produced and swallowed. So it really gets reused. So otherwise we would be losing a lot of fluids. We're going to look at 3 types of extrinsic salivary glands. So these are going to be the major salivary glands. There are others, but these are the ones that I want us to focus on. The very first one that we're going to look at is going to be called our parotid salivary gland. Parotid salivary gland is located here next to the ear. And one way how I remember it when I studied it for the first time is that I think what sounds like parotid, I think of pirates. So if you had a pirate who had a parrot sitting on its shoulder, where the parrot would be next to the ear, above the masseter muscle, that's where the parotid salivary gland would. But we end up seeing that parotid salivary gland secretes a very serous, so very, very watery secretion. And there's a duct from each parotid gland. So on each side we have one opening next to the upper jaw's second molar. So that's where the duct opens. And you can actually follow that if you do a dissection. The other salivary gland that I wanted to discuss about is going to be submandibular salivary gland. And again, the clue is in the name. So the name describes it slightly below the mandible. I personally tend to lean towards the description that it's more of like a medial to the mandible, kind of depending on how low it is, but you can kind of almost get to it from here, from the bottom of the mandible. This salivary gland, the submandibular salivary gland, secretes a mixture of watery and mucus secretion and has an opening from for each side of the base of the lingual frenulum. So you remember this connective tissue underneath the tongue that we saw earlier on. So there's an opening on both sides there. And final salivary gland that I wanted to talk about is going to be called sublingual salivary gland. Again, the name is a great clue. So it's below the tongue, the lingual structure. And this salivary gland actually has multiple ducts. It opens to multiple locations at the floor of the mouth. If I should highlight something else, I would highlight that the secretion from the sublingual salivary gland is very mucus, so thick in a characteristic. So those were our 3 salivary glands that I'd like you to know. There are minor salivary glands within the oral cavity, but for the interest of time, we're not going to go into those. And this is the diagram that we had a look of earlier on. So let's talk about a little bit about dentition, teeth within the mouth. And really how I approach when I go through this is that I divide mouth into 4 parts. So horizontally into upper and lower jaw, and vertically into left and right side. So that gives you a quadrant, and as long as you learn the teeth within a single quadrant, it's going to be easy then just to reflect those to other parts. So let's start from the interior portion. So there's going to be within each quadrant 2 incisors. These are these kind of chisel-shaped flat teeth that are ideal for things like biting apple and kind of chiseling off parts. Following that, in each quadrant, we have 1 canine. This is the evolutionary sign of our meat-eating history and meat-eating ancestors. So ideal for the sharp teeth, ideal for things like tearing meat and so on. A lot of Hollywood celebrities end up getting their canine a little smoothened as for cosmetic purposes. In certain individuals, they are very sharp and prominent to notice. Following canines, working our way towards posteriorly and laterally within the dentition, we're gonna get premolars. 2 of those, sometimes described also as bicuspids, and finally molars. Typically 3 of those. So premolars and molars have kind of this large surface area, and think they're at the back of the jaw, so the powerful muscles help to bring the upper and lower molars together. That really gives them a great surface for crushing and grinding stuff between them. So that's what the premolars and molars are ideal for. If we look at a single tooth, we notice that can be divided into 2 parts. We have the crown, which is the part above the gum, and the root, which is the part in the jawbone. Crown included the hardest, one of the hardest layers, covers in the body enamel, and then the bulk of the teeth is made of dentin. And within the central cavity, we have blood vessels, nerve endings, connective tissue, and so on. So if we have an injury or a tooth decay that reaches all the way to the central cavity, it is these nerve cells there that give the great pain that you can get with a tooth pain. So root canal, for example, would work on killing those nerve endings within the central cavity. Root instead, a couple of structures that are important. Cementum cements its socket, and periodontal ligament that helps with the same. So that was our dentition, and I think we're ready to move on our path following the road of the digestive tract. And let's have a look of the pharynx. Pharynx is made of skeletal muscle layers, especially externally, of stratified squamous epithelium. And pharynx is a structure that we've seen before when we have talked about, for example, respiration. So nasopharynx is not a part that we're interested in when we talk about digestive tract. So that's the part of the pharynx, that's the most superior behind the nasal cavity. For us, in terms of digestive system, we should not have to go there. Hopefully food doesn't go into your nasal cavity. The following parts of pharynx, so the part immediately behind oral cavity, so oropharynx, and the part above the larynx, so laryngopharynx, are going to be parts that get shared both with the respiratory and digestive system. So those are structures that you might end up seeing. When we talk about process of swallowing, and we talk about that in a scientific sense, the proper term to use would be deglutition. Deglutition is the process of swallowing. Remember that swallowing started voluntary. You can control when you want to swallow, but once it has been initiated, it does become involuntary. You can't stop the process of swallowing halfway through. It's just gonna happen. So that's what I had to say about that there. And we're ready to continue our journey and look at the next structure on this path. And this next structure is going to be our oesophagus. Oesophagus is not terribly exciting in terms of the physiology of the digestive system. It simply is a muscular tube. So yes, and its function is to allow the passage of the food from the mouth to the stomach. So yes, it has a purpose, and we actually even end up finding that these muscle fibers on the esophagus help with generating this peristaltic wave-like movement that we talked about earlier on. So passing the food along that tube. This would apply if you're in a zero gravity situation, for example, in this space. You can still swallow food and it's going to travel from your mouth to your stomach. You can even stand on your head and drink water, and the water will go up against the gravity from your mouth to your stomach. So oesophagus, in that sense, yes, there's physiology, but there's not a lot of going on in digestive functions, absorption or anything like that. It is simply just a transportation tube. Couple of other, it's one of the few structures that pass through the diaphragm. There's not a lot of structures that pass through the diaphragm. Aorta, inferior vena cava, and oesophagus come to mind as the immediate ones. What we're going to talk about, and we're going to spend a little bit time talking about, is going to be our stomach. So let's have a look of what we can conclude about the stomach. Stomach really is a temporary storage location for the food. Some of the chemical breakdown starts there, but there is no absorption happening at the stomach, or very little absorption, if any. And this is because stomach is not really adapted for the purposes of food to get absorbed. It is the storage and it is the chemicals that get mixed in there. Remember, stomach contents are very acidic, so we need to have stomach lined so that it doesn't digest itself. So if it cannot digest itself, it probably is not going to also absorb a lot of structures through those thick structures. Here we get to that terminology that I mentioned earlier on. So rather than talking about bolus, which was the structure that we used to describe food that has gone through mechanical breakdown, a mixture of saliva at the level of the mouth, now that this bolus reaches the stomach and gets mixed with stomach acid, we start talking about chyme. Chyme is this watery mixture. If you've ever had the runs, diarrhea, what comes out is very chyme-like, very watery mixture. Stomach has a large ability to shrink and expand as needed. And this is thanks to these structures that we had a look when we dissected the stomach, known as rugae. So rugae are these kind of wiggly bumps inside the stomach. And I wish that I could draw on the screen, but unfortunately my computer is not allowing me to do that at this very moment. So let's have a look of a few different parts of the stomach. What would be useful to know about different parts of the stomach? And we're going to start here where and again, I'm trying to get tools that would allow me to draw. We're going to start here where the oesophagus joins to the stomach proper. And what you'll notice, this part is known as cardia. So kind of the heart of the stomach, where this junction between the esophagus and the stomach takes place. Let's get that highlighted. There we go. What you'll notice as well is that esophagus does not join the stomach right at the very top. It's slightly below the very peak of the stomach. There is an area that's kind of above that. And this area is where a lot of the time gases end up building up. So if you go into medical imaging and you take pictures of stomach, it's very likely that you'll see air build up to the fundus, so the very top part, the roof, the superior most part of the stomach. So something to bear in mind. Bulk of the stomach, so the largest part of that is going to be our body of the stomach, and the very last distal part of the stomach is going to be called our pylorus. Pylorus can be actually further divided into pyloric antrum and pyloric canal, but for our purposes, I'm only expecting you to know that pylorus is this more distal, the last part of the stomach, if we follow the path of the travel of the food through the stomach. Two other structures that I do want to emphasize and I want us to get a chance to look at are located at both ends of the stomach. So kind of control what comes in and what goes out. I used to live in Scotland and haggis is a big food there. So haggis is of course cooked within the cow's stomach. Or I believe, or sheep's stomach, some animal stomach. And what they do literally is to tie off the stomach from these both ends. So more superiorly, the connection between the esophagus and stomach is going to be our lower esophageal sphincter. This controls that the stomach acid cannot climb up to the esophagus. This sphincter is not really anatomically visible. If you go and dissect, it will be hard to see that there, but it does exist in a physiological sense. More distally at the end of the stomach, before we move to the small intestines, we have our pyloric sphincter at the end of the pylorus. This is actually an anatomical structure, a muscle band that we end up seeing there, controlling that when we are ready to let food pass onwards from the stomach to the small intestines. Couple of other structures that I'm just going to share with you. We have our curvature on the lateral side, so facing to the side of the body. That's our greater curvature of the stomach, and more medially, the lesser curvature. So some of the terminology that you might end up running into. I do want to discuss about a couple of concepts, and the first one of this is the acid reflux. So anyone who has ever had a heartburn, what happens in acid reflux? Acid reflux takes place when the lower esophageal sphincter fails and some of the stomach acids escape to the esophagus. So if you've ever had a burp and gotten a bit of an after taste with that, or you have eaten something, you have exercised, you have done things that upset that, and you get that heartburn, that is really the stomach acids reaching to the esophagus. Esophagus is not designed to handle that strong stomach acids, so that's why you get that sensation of pain. If you have acid reflux and if it's a frequent thing, it is worth of getting it addressed. what we can do, we can give you different medications, for example, that neutralize the stomach acid so it doesn't burn the esophagus. This is important because repeated exposures of the acid to the esophagus can cause ulcers to develop in the esophagus. And of course, if this was really bad situation, it can increase your risk of developing esophageal cancers. So we want to get that taken care of and addressed. There are two other concepts that I want to talk about, and let's move on to talk about hernias a little bit. In general, hernias are when something in the body, a structure in the body, sneaks out through an opening where it should not go through. So, for example, in case of this, what we are looking of the digestive system, stomach can actually protrude through that opening in the diaphragm that was meant for only the esophagus to come through. But if stomach starts protruding through there, then we talk about hernia there, hiatal hernia. Those could be an issue. So usually not a big thing, but we want to be aware of if this keeps happening. Other one that I wanted to talk about, gastric ulcers. So you can have, remember, stomach contains very acidic material. And to protect the stomach itself, so the acid within the stomach doesn't dissolve the stomach itself, we do have a thicker lining of the stomach protecting it. If for some reason that lining gets damaged, now stomach acid gets to this lining, and this could be a problem. Some of the causes why this could happen would be, for example, certain bacterial infections. Also, taking great amounts of aspirin will damage this lining, and stomach acids now get to there. So that would be a problem. There would be painful sensation. We can treat this medications that decrease the stomach acid production, so we don't make the situation worse. But really tackling the root cause of that, which, for example, if we have bacteria, antibiotics would be what we'd be looking there. So I discussed in the class about the secretions that we find in the stomach, and I had prepared this little graph for you where I showed the relationships, how one thing affects another. And since we are approaching the end of the semester, I do want to share with you, this is how I learn. When I get a list of structures or list of concepts, I try to connect them to each other, see what are the connections, rather than just memorizing them by themselves. So as you move on your studies, that might be something that you might as well find useful. Relate this, for example, in this case, the secretions, how one secretion of the stomach affects other secretions. And all of a sudden it becomes easier to remember when you have these connections mapped out. We went through this secretions list in the class a few times, so I'm not going to spend time this time around on that. You have it there for the reference if that's something that you want to go. I'm going to share with you that I do not ask it in this class, but it is one of my favorite questions to ask in other courses where I teach regarding the digestive tract and stomach, that why do we say that stomach is not great for absorption? Why does not stomach does not do a good job with absorption? And I often offer that as a mini essay or extra credit question or so on. Like I said, I won't ask it from you, but I think it's a good topic to discuss very briefly. Remember, stomach contains very acidic environment. And what we find that most digestive enzymes, for example, they don't work very well in highly acidic environment. So for them to work for the absorption, digestion and absorption, we would need to get to a little bit more neutral pH than the acidity that we have within the stomach. So really, most of these enzymes start working only at the small intestines once we have left the stomach, and the pancreatic juice secretion from pancreas has neutralized some of that acidity, and that's when the enzymes start working hard. So that's the first reason why we do not see a lot of absorption happening in the stomach. It's just too acidic. You can think of this acidity also as a positive thing. If we consume something that we shouldn't have eaten, say something's alive, a lot of things get killed by the time they get to the stomach due to the acidity within stomach. So it does have a purpose. Other thing that we notice that stomach lacks, we don't have much of a villi there. So villi were these little kind of finger-like projections that gave us a lot of surface area. And we needed surface area for absorption to happen. So we don't have that in the stomach. So absorption for that reason as well is not ideally adapted. Final thing that we notice is that the stomach is lined with a thick mucus layer. This protects the stomach wall from the acidic conditions inside the stomach, so we don't self-digest the stomach. Well, this thick mucus layer would be hard to pass. It protects us from the acids, but it also would be hard to pass for things that we want to absorb. So it kind of forms this protective layer in that sense. So let's continue a little bit and have a look of a few other things, and just let me. Sorry about that. I had a call that was work related, but I think that we completed everything we needed to discuss about the absorption of the stomach and the stomach in general, and we are ready to move on to continue our discussion of the digestive tract, and let's have a look of the small intestines. So small intestines is the next part immediately after the stomach. The length of small intestines varies a little bit, anywhere from 2 to 4 meters, but that is a long distance. And really, if you think that that's a long distance, how does it all fit in there? It's because we jumble up that tube, so it's kind of packed up, wrapped up a little bit. Small intestines are in diameter from anywhere from 2.5 centimeters to 4 centimeters. Their main function of the small intestines is that this is where the absorption happens in the body. So this is the main site of absorption. Most of the absorption of the digestive system takes place in the small intestines. And this is because we have a large surface area. Remember, this is a huge, long duct that's jumbled up in a small place, a small space. So we have surface area, and part of the addition to this surface area is all these folds, villi, microvilli that increase it as well. When we talk about small intestines, we should look at the different parts that we have for small intestines. So small intestines started after the pyloric sphincter, and there's 3 parts really for us to know. And you might remember that the mnemonic that I gave you in the class was DJ ill, DJ that plays really sick music. So the first part is duodenum, second part jejunum, and third part ileum. Duodenum is not very long part. It's about 25 centimeters immediately after stomach, curving around the pancreas. And this part is really where the pancreatic juice, the secretions are released, and the acidic chyme that's released from the stomach gets a little bit more neutralized, and a lot of those enzymes start working. Where does jejunum and ileum start? That's a hard question, and that's sometimes a little bit more of a theoretical concept, and we don't see a clear anatomical distinction from jejunum to ileum. But once we get to the end of ileum, that's the end of the small intestines, and we're going to move on to large intestines. The first part of the large intestines is going to be cecum. So the transitions point, this valve between the small intestines and large intestines, is going to be ileocecal valve. Let's have a look of, I've listed here a few secretions of the small intestines. I'll let you review those if that's something that you're interested in. And we're simply going to jump onwards and upwards with the large intestines. So let's discuss large intestines. So like I said, small intestines was the main site of absorption. So what do large intestines do then? Why do we have those? Well, this is where the water gets reabsorbed or taken back to the body. Remember, chyme was very watery secretion. And if we didn't recover that water, we would lose so much water whenever we go to the bathroom that we would probably battle dehydration. That's why if someone has a diarrhea, you can die of that as a result of becoming dehydrated. So really, that's why the large intestines are important in recovering that water. With the water, you also learned, we talked about that in the class, electrolytes get recovered. So I don't know what I've been meaning to write here. It should say electrolytes. They follow the water and get re-updated. So in terms of the large intestines, there are 3 parts of the large intestines that I want to discuss. The first part was cecum, kind of this pouch-like part immediately after the ileum. From the cecum, we also have appendix hanging out. Remember, this appendix was a little bit useless structure for us, if you think these days. Why do we have that? What good does it do for us? Well, it's speculated that it's probably more like an evolutionary remnant. That's where the bacteria for digesting plant-based material was housed. And since we don't eat that much plant-based food anymore, it's not serving as important role anymore, but it is still there. Of course, you can get appendix infected, so sometimes that may need to be removed. So that's the story of that. The next part of the large intestine that's really the biggest and most important part, I think, in terms of the size of these structures, anatomical structures, is our colon. And our colon we had separated 2 different parts of that. So traveling on the right side from inferior to the superior portion, so climbing up if we follow the path, is going to be our ascending colon. Then from the superior portion on the right side of the abdominal cavity, traveling to the left side is going to be our transverse colon. Coming down on the left side from superior to inferior portion is going to be our descending colon. And finally, sigmoid colon forms almost a little bit like an S-shaped structure before we reach the rectum and anus. So that has been the path of the digestive tract, that tube that travels, carries food. We started from one opening, mouth, to the other opening. And what I'd like to do now is to look at 3 really important accessory organs that we should talk about. And we're going to start with the liver. And I think I shared with you in the class that liver plays many purposes. And liver is the largest gland that we find in the body, has 4 primary lobes. I've listed some structures that you might identify from there. When I was bored one of these days, I listed all the functions that I could think of that liver does, and I got to 100 and I gave up. I was like, there has to be better things to do. But from our purposes, what liver does, it's all about production of bile. So bile is going to be an important secretion made by the liver. Liver, of course, played many other roles: detoxification, removal of things like alcohol, drugs from the blood, filtering blood, old red blood cells, storage of the energy, as we discussed, from the blood, and so on and so on. But really, the bile production is the important for us when we discuss digestive system. And then bile travels from the liver through this duct system that you see structures listed for that. The next structure that I want to talk about is gallbladder, and this is located kind of underneath the liver. This is where the bile travels to from the liver. So bile gets stored and concentrated in the gallbladder. For some reason, individuals often think that gallbladder would produce bile. Remember, this is not the case. It is liver that makes the bile bile gets stored and concentrated in the gallbladder. What can happen sometimes is that some of the components of the bile actually escape from the bile itself. And one of these components could be cholesterol. When cholesterol escapes from the bile within the gallbladder, it can form gallstones. And these were really painful, difficult to pass, and so on sometimes. The final accessory organ that I do want to discuss with you is going to be our pancreas. So pancreas is an organ that we saw earlier on, wrapped here nicely on this diagram with in the kind of armpit of the duodenum. It's the first part of the small intestines underneath the stomach. And pancreas was one that we have often used as an example of a gland that's both endo and exocrine gland. And of course, we discussed about the endocrine function of the pancreas when we looked at the hormones, and the endocrine function was to do with the blood sugar regulation, so production of insulin and glucagon. What we see in terms of what's important for us and interest of us in the digestive system is the exocrine function, and pancreas produces pancreatic juice. Pancreatic juice is the most complete digestive secretion of the, or most complete secretion of the digestive system. So that's really, really important secretion. Pancreatic juice is really what neutralized also the acidic chyme leaving the stomach. So we get the pancreatic juice released from the hepatic-pancreatic ampulla to the duodenum, and there, as it neutralizes these conditions, now we start to get a lot of the enzymes more active and doing their job. So to wrap up everything about the digestive system, I want to remind us about these terms. What terms do we use? What are the terms that we talk about? So you do eat food, but once food enters to the mouth and gets mechanically broken down, crushed, and mixed with saliva, now we start talking about bolus. So bolus is the mixture of saliva and mechanically broken down food. Bolus is this kind of more of a bowl, solid-like structure that's a little more wetter, easier to swallow than dry food. So this was important for the process of deglutition. Once bolus reaches the stomach and gets mixed with stomach acids, we now have chyme, so mixture of stomach acid and food material. This was the very liquidy, watery stuff. And we saw examples of that when someone had diarrhea. And of course, you remember at the level of large intestines, we recover the material, the water from the chyme, and now the dry material only is left behind, things that cannot be digested, so a lot of fiber, bacteria, and so on. This is now going to be called our feces. So it is the feces that we eliminate from the body. So I hope that that made sense, and that really completes our review of the digestive system and the study guide for the digestive system. As you saw, that really forms the main part of our study guide. So that gives you a clue that that's a really important part of what you can expect to see in the exam. However, for the sake of completedness, and there are questions, but not as many, but still some questions, I do want to discuss about the reproductive system. So male and female reproductive system. We'll go through that as the next concept. So going to page 8 of the study guide, let's start with a male reproductive system. But before we jump to the male reproductive system, I think it's going to be useful for us to talk about some general concepts that we see on both. So what's going to be most important for us is to focus on the gonads. These are the primary sex organs. So males and females have primary sex organs, and all other structures that we're going to see are going to be accessory sex organs. So the male primary sex organ is going to be our testes. So testes had a function that was twofold: production of the sex cell, so the gamete. Gamete is the term for sex cell, and in case of a male, that's going to be the sperm or spermatozoa, if you want to use proper language. In addition to production of the sperm, another thing that we end up seeing that testes produce is the sex hormones. So these are going to be important, and in case of men, androgens, especially testosterone, that we're interested. For females, what we end up seeing as the primary sex organ, that's going to be the ovary. And ovaries produce the egg cell known as ova or oocyte. You can see both of these terms being used. And of course, also sex hormones, so estrogen, progesterone, and so on, are going to be really, really important for us in terms of the female reproductive tract. And now let's have a look of the male reproductive system. And I have a diagram here that I think you can remember that we've used before. You can color it, color code it. You can draw arrows, labels, stuff, up to you. I'm going to go through it a little quicker. You do have the full diagram from the past, but I want to highlight the structures. And the structure that we're going to start with is going to be our testes. And again, because I cannot draw, for some reason, my keypad doesn't allow me to do that. I'm just going to put dots to highlight. So the first structure that we're going to look at is going to be the testes. Testes is the primary sex organ of the male, and this is where the sperm cells are being produced. And remember, of course, also the sex hormones. So two important things that the testes produce. On top of the testes lies epididymis. Epididymis is a site where the sperm goes to mature and be stored until it's needed. So like a student of mine made a discovery or a realization, even sperm has to go to school. So that's where the sperm is stored and matures until it is needed. On top of the testes, this structure. Then we have this long tube that we see. This long tube is known as our vas deferens or ductus deferens or ductus deferentia. So many names that we might end up seeing for that. But it is a muscular tube, muscular duct, and its main function is to transport the sperm from the testes and epididymis all the way to the posterior side of the urinary bladder. So what you'll notice, vas deferens arches over and above the urinary bladder and then comes down on the posterior side of it. Vas deferens, because it has this muscular characteristic, this is also ideal for helping to transport the sperm with these peristaltic wave-like contractions. What you'll notice is that at the end of vas deferens, we've got this expansion, this kind of a chamber-like area. This area is known as our ampulla. So it's on the posterior aspect of the urinary bladder. So something to notice there. Well, now we have two terms for the ducts that we can see. What happens for the tubing that goes on. So let's have a look of that together. So ejaculatory duct is the part of this tract, this duct system, that's only for the male reproductive system. So it's going to start right after the ampulla and continue to the prostate. But once we get to the prostate and urine gets mixed into the contents that travel within there, we're going to be starting to talk about urethra. So urethra is shared by both reproductive and urinary system. So this part of the duct that starts where the urine and semen gets mixed and travels all the way through the penis to the penis opening at the very distal end. So that's going to be the urethra. So for this reason, sometimes males get an urge after sexual intercourse to urinate, to kind of rinse off, clean this shared duct system. So that's the urethra that we've added to this diagram. What I'd like to do next is talk about a few glands that are going to be important. And we're going to start with seminal vesicle. Oh, I didn't mean to use that color. Let's change the color just to make it a little easier to follow. So seminal vesicle. Seminal vesicle is located next to the ampulla, and the secretions from seminal vesicle are released when we do ejaculate, and they are rich in, for example, in fructose. So this fructose, if you think what sperm has done, it has done a long journey, about 45 centimeters of duct system at this stage. It needs a boost of energy, and seminal vesicle provides that boost of energy for the sperm to have the energy to keep swimming and making the journey further. What I'd like to highlight as the next structure is going to be our prostate gland. So let's discuss prostate gland a little more. So of course, prostate gland secretions also add to the semen that we produce. But the reason why I really want us to take a moment to talk about prostate gland is that a lot of men over 60, about half of us, end up with extensive growth of the prostate gland. This extensive growth of the prostate gland can cause some of these ducts inside it to get constricted, and now we have then, as a result of that, problems with emptying the urinary bladder, problems with sexual intercourse, things like that. So how do we treat that? You can get the prostate completely removed. That's normally not necessary. What we can do, we can just simply take almost like a pizza slice, a cut away from that to open up these ducts so that the material can pass through. One more gland that I do want to talk about as it relates to the male reproductive system, that's going to be our bulbourethral gland, sometimes also known as Copper's gland. And this gland releases secretions in response to sexual stimulation, so adds to the semen. For example, playing a role in the pH regulation and so on, so that the sperm has a good chance of survival within the female tract. So female tract of reproductive tract, of course, tries to prevent us from having things getting in that shouldn't be getting in. So the conditions are not ideal for things to survive there. So that would also affect the sperm. So in response to that, what we do, we end up releasing secretions from the Copper's gland that kind of neutralize that a little bit. So the sperm has a greater chance of survival. Two final structures that I want to discuss are our erectile tissues, corpus cavernosum and corpus spongiosum. They are what's around the penis, so they swell as blood rushes into these structures, and this gives the erection, so makes the penis erect, more solid, harder, in response to the rich blood supply there. Why would we get an erection? Well, erection helps us to deliver the semen, including the sperm, further into the female reproductive tract, so we have a greater chance of it making its way all the way where it needs to go and for fertilization to occur. So this is our erectile tissue, the last part that I really wanted to mention there. In terms of the male reproductive system, a couple of other notions to make. Scrotum is where the testes are located. So this kind of a skin sac that has also muscle supplied there. So reason why we have a scrotum that, for male is that for sperm to develop, sperm requires a temperature that's about 3 Celsius degrees lower than the body temperature. So we need to lower the temperature a little bit for the sperm to have ideal conditions to develop, and we do that by having a scrotum. Of course, sometimes we might need to bring the testes a little closer to the body, for example, in cold environment, and that's where muscles such as dartos muscle and cremaster muscle play a role, pulling the scrotum and the testes a little closer to the body. Couple of parts of the sperm, and I really feel bad that we cannot draw at the moment on the screen. For some reason, I managed to not have my finger pad working correctly. So here's a quick sketch that I did, and I'm gonna hold on with me a second. Here's a quick sketch that I made of sperm that hopefully helps you to see the 3 different parts that we're going to talk about. So we have our head of the sperm, the midpiece of the sperm, and the tail of the sperm. So let's discuss all of those. So the head part of the sperm is what contains the genetic material that we're trying to pass onwards to the egg cell from the male part. So that's an important one. Another thing that the head includes, it includes all those enzymes that we need to digest the egg, so the sperm actually makes it to the egg cell. Midpiece contains a great amount of mitochondria, so energy production of ATP, so that the tail can do its job, the movement, the locomotion of the sperm cell, so the swimming movement. So we end up finding a lot of mitochondria at the midpiece. I have provided a little bit more information about what happens in the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis and also for the testosterone and sperm amounts over time. So I'll let you have a look at those if that's something that interests you. And what I'd like to do next, I'd like to shift our attention, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about female reproductive system. So I think that that's going to be important. I have sketched this diagram that we've used before that's kind of a useful when we review various structures of the female reproductive system. Of course, please do remember that this is a schematic diagram, a little bit oversimplified, but I think it's a good place for us to start from. And the first structure that I want us to talk about is going to be the ovary. So ovary is the female main reproductive structure. So that's where the egg cells are produced, and that's also where the sex hormones were produced. One thing that's worthwhile to notice when we talk about the female reproductive system is that there is no direct connection between the ovary and rest of the structures. So the uterine tube, or fallopian tube as it's sometimes called, is not directly connected to the ovary. So there is a little bit of a gap. So what this results in is that when the egg is shed from the ovary, egg is actually shoved into the pelvic cavity and travels for a short distance there outside the female reproductive system. So there's no direct physical connection between these parts. And this is what brings us to talk about our next structure, which is going to be called fimbriae. Fimbriae are like this, and of course the scale is not the same and the function is not the same, but a little bit like a finger-like adaptations at the very distal end of the uterine fallopian tube. And the role of the fimbriae is to catch that egg cell that has been shed to the pelvic cavity. So fimbriae play a role on that, kind of catching it, getting it back to the female reproductive tract where it needs to go. So that's our fimbriae. The other structure that we see immediately after fimbriae is going to be a structure called a fundibulum. What a fundibulum does, it is this kind of a cone-shaped structure, like I said, after the fimbriae. It helps to direct that egg cell that we have recovered to the uterine tube and to the fallopian tube, to the right direction. So let's discuss about the uterine fallopian tube a little bit more. What we end up seeing is that there is a muscular tube. It has cilia that helps to swipe the egg cell towards the uterus, helping that journey as well. Really the main function of the uterine tube is the transportation of the egg cell. Uterine tube itself can be divided into two parts. A major part of it is gonna be this ampulla, which is a little bit more wiggly part, if you wish, of the uterine tube. This is where the egg cell gets fertilized. So the egg cell travels here and sperm travels here. They meet and the fertilization occurs here. So once we have a fertilized egg cell, it takes about 2 to 3 days for that egg cell to travel into the uterus. And during these 2 to 3 days, we have time now for the uterus to prepare for that fertilized egg cell so we can provide optimal conditions for it to then implant there and grow and develop there. The other part of the uterine tube isthmus is the more proximal part to the uterus. It's a short section, a little thicker wall that then finally carries the egg to the uterus. So let's have a look of the uterus a little bit. The function of uterus is that that's where the egg cell goes. So uterus prepares to receive and sustain the embryo that travels in there. And uterus can be divided into 3 parts. So let's have a look of these parts, and some of this terminology will be familiar. So you'll notice that that's the secret in A&P, that you learn the terms once and you can apply them in many contexts. So the most superior part of the uterus, kind of if you wish to describe it as a roof of the uterus, is going to be our fundus. So the roof of the uterus, the top part. A majority of the uterus is going to be then the body. Oh, I didn't mean to put that color. Let's change it. Is going to be the body of the uterus. And what we really want, oh, I didn't mean to do that either. Let's try once more. That's our body of uterus. And what we really hope that happens is that the egg cell implants either to the fundus or the body of the uterus. These would be ideal locations because we don't really want the egg cell to implant to the cervix, which is the last part, because what will happen as the embryo develops, we will form a placenta. And it could be that a placenta now, if it's within the cervix, extends over the cervical opening. And before the baby can be born, the placenta would get ripped and the baby's supply of blood and oxygen through the blood would get compromised, and that would put the baby's life into the risk. So this is why we do the early pregnancy ultrasound, to see that the egg cell has implanted and the baby that's developing is at the location that's ideal for that. So the last part of the uterus that I've mentioned now, let's have a look of the cervix. So cervix is the final part. It extends a little bit into the vagina, as you can see on this diagram. And what's noteworthy about that is that this is how the cervical smears are taken. So we can access a part of the uterus through the vagina here and get that sample to study what's happening there. And then, like I mentioned, we have the remaining part to add to the diagram. Are a vagina and the vulva and perineum, the external structures. So really the function of the vagina is to receive the penis, and also that is, of course, the birth canal that the baby has to pass through as it is born. We do have a bunch of ligaments that serve a purpose of holding the ovary and rest of the female reproductive tract on its place. So ovarian, suspensory, and broad ligaments. And I covered those in quite a bit of detail in our lecture videos. So I'll just leave those for you to review there if that's something that you're interested in. And that brings us to discuss about this diagram that's probably my favorite diagram that I've ever drawn. So hopefully it will be useful. And like I shared with you, that is probably what the extra credit question is going to be about. And because I do have a little bit of a hard time that I don't have the pointer, I don't have the pen working on my computer at the moment, we're going to do our best to go through this. So remember, everything started with the pituitary gland that secreted follicle-stimulating hormone. So follicle-stimulating hormone drives the development of the follicle. So follicle is the egg cell and the developing egg cell and structure around it. Once we get also a surge in luteinizing hormone, that now triggers the ovulation, the shedding of the egg cell. Egg cell is shed in response to raising luteinizing hormone levels. What's left of the follicle now degenerates and becomes corpus luteum. And if there is a pregnancy, corpus luteum survives and starts to secrete hormones that are very, very important for us for the maintenance of the pregnancy. If there is no fertilization, pregnancy has not occurred, corpus luteum will over time degenerate and just fade away, disappear. So let's have a look what the corpus luteum contributed to this process through secretions. Corpus luteum secretes estrogen, and estrogen drives the proliferation of the uterine wall lining. So the thickening of the uterus, the wall of uterus. Another hormone secreted by corpus luteum is going to be our progesterone. And what progesterone does, it promotes vascularization of the uterine wall lining, so making it very rich in blood supply. Think of if there is a pregnancy, the baby, early baby implants there. Now we want to have a lot of blood supply there for the development of the placenta, development of the fetus and embryo. Other thing that progesterone does, it also contributes to the glandularization of the uterine wall lining, so making it very glandular, so that's what it helps with as well. If there was a pregnancy, these hormones get secreted and the uterine wall lining keeps remaining, getting nice, thick, vascular, glandular for the baby to develop there. If there is no pregnancy, then the corpus luteum degenerates, these hormones get stopped from being secreted, and the menstrual bleeding happens at the end of the cycle and beginning of a new cycle. So we're shedding away that lining that no longer is needed or useful. So I hope that makes sense. That's a quick summary. I think that a full summary is available on the lecture videos. Couple of things that I do want to mention real quickly. Let's talk super fast about menstruation. So the first menstrual bleeding first menses are known as menarche. And if we have pause ending of the menstrual cycle or menstrual bleeding for a period of 1 year, we talk about the person has gone into menopause. Mammary glands are actually modified sweat glands. Their function is to produce the breast milk. We do have mammary glands both in males and females, but they're functional only in females. A mammary gland cancer, breast cancer, is possible also on males, more common on females. So the key thing with mammary glands was the production of the milk to nourish the newborn immediately at the birth, and after that. Humans are the only species that keeps drinking milk after infancy, and we actually drink cow milk. So most animals use milk, or many animals use milk to nourish their newborn, but that ends at some point. There's a lot of data, a lot of evidence of the benefits of breast milk over milk supplement. So transfer of antibodies, more energy rich, transfer of a lot of other good things from the mother's body and so on, as the child's own immune system and so on are developing. So there's benefits to that. But we absolutely do not want to shame anyone if there's a reason why they cannot breastfeed their child. So that completes the review of our study guide for this exam 4. And I know that it's been a lot of information, but really I think a lot of that information is very familiar to you. And I think that this is the final formal teaching session that we'll have together. I will be reaching out to you once you have completed your exam and practical with details where your grade is standing. And that allows you to choose then whether next week you want to complete the extra credit activity, or whether you choose that you don't need to complete it if your grade is where you want it to be. So those are the next steps. I will be sending to each and every one of you on Canvas an individual message with your final grade, so you can make all those decisions, and a couple of other personal notions. I want to thank you all for having been part of this class, but I'll save that to that message. At this point, I'm going to wrap up our review session here, and I hope you have a very good rest of the week. And even if I don't get to see you in person, we'll connect before the semester is over on the finals week project and on where you're standing with your grade. With all that having been said, I hope you have a good rest of the day, rest of the week, and rest of the semester. Thank you again.